has found that in countries with high individualism, consumers tend to look for variety seeking. And in the opposite case, when there is high collectivism, there is no variety seeking. So this basically points out to the idea that the relationship may not be universal, that will be depending on the type of country where you are operating, and also in the type of industry. So in this case, the second hypothesis goes into testing this and how does the relationship behave under different conditions at the country and industry level. For doing this, I developed a questionnaire where I use different types of questions. I use monadic questions for checking consumer satisfaction, perceived quality, perceived value. The industry survey were 4 product industries and 6 service industries in 8 countries: Thailand, Japan, China, Bolivia, France, USA, Germany, Uyghur. The respondent distribution was most of the respondents were from Japan and Bolivia, followed by Germany. The respondents were mostly male consumers. In the case of the industry distribution, as you can see, most of the respondents were from Japan, in the case of mobile phones specifically, followed by PCs. To calculate the market share, what it basically is divide the number of brand users by the number of respondents. What they used was the regional market share, not national market share, because there was a previous study of the market share in each area. And the results, for example, in the case of the Japanese market share, were similar to the results offered by the Young Research Institute in 2009. So what they basically did is to calculate the correlation coefficients between average consumer satisfaction and market share, and also the determinants of consumer satisfaction. As you can see, in the case of the pool data, we found that the relationship, actually, the correlation is negative. So this supports the idea from Fornell, and all the variables, especially perceived value, show this negative correlation. And these findings were supported also by other researchers like Anderson in 1994. In order to see how this research behaves in a more specific way, how this mechanism works, there are some characteristics of the data and the countries. For example, in the case of China, there are only 2 industries that offer mobile phone services. So this type of characteristics of the industry of the country can influence the relationship between consumer satisfaction and market share. So in order to disentangle this effect, we use hierarchical linear modeling to measure the random individual variations and the industry level variations, because the data is thought to be nested between the individual level and the industry level. So there were 2 equations where basically this is the first equation of the industry level, the consumer satisfaction from country I, and industry J, and company K. And similarly, the correlation coefficient was calculated at the second level to calculate the market share different at the country and the industry level. So after running the model, we found the following results. As it is expected, in the case of USA, for example, we found that there's this negative correlation between market share and consumer satisfaction. However, as you can see in the case of China or developing countries, we found that there's this positive correlation. So what this is basically happening is it's pointing out that the relationship between market share and consumer satisfaction, it's dependent on the type of country where you are operating. So for doing this, we additionally calculated 2 different models where we calculated a country dummy, one for developed country and 0 for developing country. And we ran the model, and we found that this the influence in this case is negative and significant. So to see how are the characteristics of each industry, we calculated a proxy for competitiveness, that's what we call it, which is basically this name relative consumer satisfaction, which is consumer satisfaction of country I and industry J minus consumer satisfaction of the industry of country I. So we are eliminating the influences of consumer satisfaction at the country level to have a purer proxy of competitiveness, or in other words, the consumer satisfaction for each industry. So afterwards, we calculated the interaction, and we found that the level of development and the proxy for competitiveness, the interaction is positive. So I will be showing you in an easy way how can we explain this. First of all, on the y-axis, we have the relationship between consumer satisfaction and market share, this correlation. Similarly for perceived quality, perceived image, and perceived value. On the x-axis, we have the relative consumer satisfaction, relative perceived quality, relative image, and relative perceived value. So we graph developed and versus developing countries. So in the case of developed countries, happens this interesting thing, that when relative consumer satisfaction is low, you find that the correlation is negative. Therefore, you are operating under the ideal point model theory. However, when you have high industry competitiveness, in this case relative consumer satisfaction, perceived quality, perceived value, or image, you will be operating under the variety seeking theory because you will be having a more positive correlation. So this basically is telling us that the theory of Fornell, it is depending on the type of industry and the type of country we are operating. So it is not universal. So if we go a little bit deeper, we can draw the 63 correlation coefficients for each industry in developed and developing countries. And you will find that in the case, for example, developing countries, the correlation is basically flat. However, when you check the correlation coefficients for developed countries, you will see that this is positive. So what we can conclude is that the negative correlation or no correlation found by Fornell is context specific. Second, we can say that the high market maturity or development of the country and high relative consumer satisfaction makes a more positive correlation between market share, consumer satisfaction, perceived quality, and image. Also, we can say that high industry competitiveness or relative consumer satisfaction is important to have this higher market share and higher consumer satisfaction. So, what we find from this is that industry competitiveness basically triggers a virtuous cycle between market share and consumer satisfaction. This actually makes sense because when you are a company and you try to invest in improving consumer satisfaction, then you want also your market to improve. Therefore, this supports the idea that this virtuous cycle happens in developed countries in general. Now, I would like to talk about the influence of culture on consumer satisfaction from chapter 4. But basically, what I want to see is whether this influence of individual culture is direct or mediated by product experience. For doing this, I wrote a chapter, the elucidation of the mechanism behind the influence of uncertainty avoidance on consumer attitudes towards Japanese products and services. So there is previous research that has found that uncertainty avoidance, which is one dimension of consumer satisfaction, is pretty important and has a negative relationship with average consumer satisfaction. As I previously said, there is also evidence from other literature that have found that culture influences consumer satisfaction and found at the same time that culture influences the determinants of consumer satisfaction. If you go into this kind of papers of literature, you will find that, first of all, they have used only pool data. The characteristic that there's high product risk and high switching costs. So this research, using individual level data, basically proposed that uncertainty avoidance has a negative influence on the determinants of consumer satisfaction. So we think that the influence on uncertainty avoidance is indirect and not direct. Second, as you know, there are some characteristics of products and services. Products are tangible, are easy to assess the value, and they have homogeneous quality. Moreover, consumers do not need to participate in the process of receiving a product. Therefore, they become easier to evaluate, and consumers, due to uncertainty avoidance, which make them want more control or crave for control, they will make stricter evaluations. However, in the case of services are intangible, their value is not easy to assess, the quality is quite heterogeneous, and even consumers have to participate in the delivery of the service. Therefore, they not be too strict with themselves when they are evaluating a product, and you will expect to not have too strict evaluations. What we think is that uncertainty avoidance actually has a stronger influence in the case of products than in the case of services. And that's what we are to test. For doing this, we developed a framework, and we first calculated the direct influence of uncertainty avoidance. For doing this, we calculated some gender, industry, and age dummies. And what we found First of all, is that uncertainty avoidance has a negative but not significant influence on consumer satisfaction.